A bit lit, celebrating research and creativity of all kinds. Kristen, Mary, it's so very good to see you both. I'll ask you to introduce yourselves in just a moment, but we're speaking today about your fabulous project, Canonicity, Obscenity, and the Making of Modern Chaucer. I'm really looking forward to learning about what happens to Geoff post 1700. Can we call him Geoff? Is that all right? If we're
Yes, let's do that.
And I was already excited about this conversation, but I will let our listeners and our viewers know that just before we pressed record, you were asking me what kind of language you were allowed to say in the making of the film. So I'm even more excited now, as I know that having a conversation about whether we can say the word arse or not is not always how a bit lit film starts. So I'm very the arse friendliness of this conversation as we move forward.
Absolutely.
So may I ask you both to introduce yourselves, please? Perhaps if we start with Mary.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. We're just absolutely delighted to be here. And so I'm Mary Flannery, and I am Swiss National Science Foundation Eccellenza Professorial Fellow at the University of Bern. I know it's a fabulous mouthful of a title, and it's one that I'm lucky enough to have because the Swiss National Science Foundation gave us the grant for this 5-year project, which is looking at the transmission and reception of Chaucerian obscenity from 1700 to 2020. And so by obscenity, we're referring to sexual and scatological language and content primarily. Hence my question about whether we can use language like arse and its ilk. But since I've mentioned Chaucer, I should probably say just a couple of words about him too. So Geoffrey Chaucer is a 14th century poet. He's writing in the second half of the 14th century, died in 1400. And probably viewers and listeners will best know him as the author of the Canterbury Tales, which is a collection of tales that are taken from lots of different genres, everything from beast fable, which you'll hear more about later, to saints' lives, romance, and everything in between. And each of these tales is told by a different fictional pilgrim narrator as they're on their way from London to Canterbury to visit the shrine of Thomas Becket. And this whole kind of premise comes about because the host of this journey, Harry Bailey, proposes that they have a tale-telling competition to see who can tell the most entertaining tale. And my favorite detail out of all of this is that the prize for the best tale is a meal at the expense of all the other pilgrims, which I think is an absolutely fabulous prize to have. But anyway, this whole project came about because of the fact that Chaucer has these kinds of two double reputations, as it were, in the modern imagination. On the one hand, he's known as the father of English poetry. He kind of stands at the head of this great English literary canon. But on the other hand, he is known for his bawdy humor, the fart jokes, the illicit sex that we see coming up in a couple of the Canterbury Tales. And so our project is really interested in how those two reputations work alongside one another over the last 300 years. I'm the team leader for the project, and I'm working with a postdoctoral researcher, Amy Brown, who's not with us today. I think she's somewhere else in Switzerland plotting a separate contribution to your series. And my doctoral researcher who's with me today, and that's Kristen Curtis. I'll let her introduce herself.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Kristen Haas-Curtis. I'm the doctoral researcher on Mary's project. I got my bachelor's degree in psychology a long, long time ago. And when I went back to school, I decided I was going to study what I finally wanted to study, which was English literature. And I remember the very first week of this, the very first class, walking into the Chaucer class and going, oh, this class, this scares me. I'm not smart enough for this. This feeling has persisted. However, at least now I come at it with a good dose of fun, and generally I love what I'm doing every day. In addition to working on Mary's project, I am also an independent cartoonist, and that tends to inform how I do my work, and I suspect that'll come up later. But in Mary's project, I am working on The Wife of Bath, specifically on her prologue and what's been happening with that through adaptation.
Yeah, great, thank you. And you're very open in the comics themselves about that question of, am I smart enough for this? And you bring your readers into that, which I think is so important because all of us ask that question whenever we encounter anything new, and it's so empowering to see that happening. So I like our kind of cue for thinking about Chaucer as kind of poetry dad of English literature, and at the same time a very naughty boy. Like, that's a good
yes, indeed.
Things like he's almost like Virgil, the Roman poet, but at the same time South Park. That was just
yeah, no, absolutely. And it's incredible how even the word Chaucer or Chaucerian has become shorthand for, naughty English humor. It's really kind of to that extent.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely fascinating. And your project begins from 1700. And I want to say, firstly, before I ask you why that is and what that brings us, to start at that point and move forward towards the present day. But for a bit, viewers who are interested to find out what happened before 1700, the prequel to your own project, we made a film with Megan Cook, which you can find on the website too. We also have a film with Eric Weisskott, thinking about the history of medieval and early modern verse, and what a weird place Chaucer has in it, kind of the canonization, the placing of iambic pentameter, particular kinds of 5-beat based verse style in the English tradition. That's kind of one example of the ways in which he was an English dad, I guess. But yeah, would you mind telling us, please, 1700 onwards, what does that give us as a kind of date and a way to think about Chaucer?
Yeah, first of all, it's daunting to know we're appearing in the wake of Megan's appearance on this show. She's a hard act to follow. We're going to do our best. But so 1700, I mean, first of all, it's a conveniently round number. It's always nice when you get a date that has a 0 at the end as your starting position. But in the case of this project, I chose it really because it coincides with the publication of John Dryden's Fables, Ancient and Modern, which is published in 1700. And this text really marks a key turning point in the history of Chaucer criticism for several reasons. First, it's the first time that Chaucer is referred to as the father of English poetry. This is something that happens in Dryden's preface, which I really encourage people to go away and read. It's a good read in and of itself. And so medievalists who are listening may be throwing their hands in the air and saying, wait a minute, Thomas Hoccleve in the early 15th century was also already referring to Chaucer as a father figure. And that is true. But the difference in this case is that instead of a poet who is pointing to Chaucer as a kind of father for himself and his own poetic undertakings, what we're seeing is Dryden doing something much larger, really establishing him as the father figure for this huge English poetic tradition that's already been in place for hundreds of years. The second point is that this publication is the first time where we see modern English translations of some of Chaucer's texts being presented alongside the Middle English originals. So in other words, what we're seeing is Chaucer's texts being brought to an entirely new audience, one that may not be quite as well acquainted with his antiquated English. And this is also key because it sets off a century in which we see suddenly adaptations, modernizations flourishing for the first time. And it's also the first time that we see new editions of Chaucer's works being produced for more than a century. The last time somebody had undertaken a new edition, it was 1598 and 1602. But most importantly for our project, Fables, Ancient and Modern is key because it's also the first time when we see an editor noting that he's excluded some of the Canterbury Tales on the basis of their ribaldry. Even at the same time that he's acknowledging that ribaldry is hugely entertaining. And so there is a short passage from the preface that I want to read out now, in which he describes the way he's gone about selecting the tales that he's chosen. So he chooses the Knight's Tale, the Nun's Priest's Tale, and the Wife of Bath's Tale. They're not the Wife of Bath's prologue. And he explains that he has chosen only tales that, quote, savor nothing of immodesty, unquote. And so apparently that's what he thinks of these particular tales. But he notes that if I had desired more to please than to instruct, the reeve, the miller, the shipman, the merchant, the summoner, and above all, the Wife of Bath in the prologue to her tale would have procured me as many friends and readers as there are beaux and ladies of pleasure in the town. And so I love this, first of all, because this is a very useful list of where to go to find the immodest stuff in the each of these characters are ones who tell pretty immodest tales or relate immodest anecdotes in the case of the Wife of Bath. But also it's wonderful to see how he's noting their exclusion, but also noting that these are really entertaining. These are pleasing tales to read. So it's about as subtle a kind of go away and read these on your own kind of cue as I think you could possibly get. But The Wife of Bath, which I'll let Kristen talk about a bit more, is particularly interesting because she's singled out twice in the preface. First, she singled out here, above all, the wife of Bath in the prologue to her tale. And then she singled out a second time when Dryden says that her prologue is simply too licentious, as he puts it, to have included in this collection. And actually, Kristen drew a beautiful comic in which we see the wife of Bath hovering over Dryden as he's sitting in an arm back, wing back chair, and his wig is popping off. That's my favorite part, as he remarks, "'Tis too licentious." But I'll let Kristen tell you a bit more about her creative process in relation to that and other drawings.
So that panel itself comes from a comic that I'm making that is running alongside my studies that I'm doing with Mary. So in addition to doing dissertation research, I'm also doing a comic that follows two specific threads. One of them is the wife of Bath, who is the ghost informing my studies, who has a lot to say, sort of like a Yelp review of all of her previous adapters. So she wants to interact with these texts and she's happy somebody's finally listening to her. And the other thread is following my process of trying to learn how it is we do this thing called a PhD. And so these two stories tend to intertwine, and I needed to have Dryden in there because this line, this "'tis too licentious," gives one of the first reactions to the wife of Bath. And I was trying to picture, what is this going to look like? My first thought was, "'tis too licentious" is pretty straightforward. Dryden doesn't approve, and that's that. But drawing is a slow process. And so as I planned this drawing, I started thinking there was more to it than that. I was like, well, does he not approve? Or does he think he's not supposed to approve? Or does he wholeheartedly approve, but he can't say that? And like Mary said, he's trying to point out to people, this is the direction you might be interested in going in. And I wanted the drawing to capture that ambiguity to that reading. So what you have is Dryden sitting in his chair in the shadow of the wife of Bath as she looms over him with her giant hat, and he has a book. And his facial expression, it's kind of a smile, but it's kind of just a speaking face. You can't read how exactly he feels, but his wig is popping off, because for him to come into contact with the wife of Bath is a literal hair-raising experience. He may be shocked, he may be offended, he may be purely delighted, but either way, it's evoking that kind of a reaction. And if it weren't for having to draw this out, I probably wouldn't have spent as much time with that passage as I did.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I love the idea that you two are haunted by the ghost in your studies, Kristen. So you're depicting Dryden being haunted by the same ghost, which is bothering you as you do your work. So there's all kinds of interesting stuff going on there. If I start with Dryden, first of all, if that's right, I'm thinking about some of the things that Mary gave us. I mean, I kind of flippantly mentioned Virgil, but of course Dryden is the translator of Virgil, and he's thinking about Englishness and maybe Britishness and maybe empire at the same time as he's trying to cleanse this new daddy that he's trying to create for English literature of certain amounts of licentiousness. I'm fascinated by the idea that there is a correct amount of licentiousness, just the right amount. Happy. So there's, I'm thinking not just about 1700, but beyond 1700, there are all kinds of kind of empire building questions to be asked about what Dryden does and its effectiveness, given that we can still talk about Chaucer in a way that we can't about almost any other medieval writer, and people will at least have, there's at least name recognition there. And then we've got the questions Kristen's asking about. I mean, I love the idea of working through the wife of Bath to think about essentially PhD methodology. What kind of PhD student would the wife of Bath be is the first question I want to ask in response to that. And how is it doing a PhD whilst being haunted? I guess I'd love to hear from both of you a little bit more about the process of adaptation, both for a research project and for creative work. Maybe if we start with Kristen and then move to Mary on that.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. So I'm trying to think of where to start with that. My approach to adaptation has been, it was taken from a theory of adaptation by Linda Hutchian. And one of the points she makes is that adaptation is not just the work that you're holding, it's also a process of creative the work. So it's this reinterpretation followed by a recreation. And it's also a process of how the work is, the reception of the work, especially keeping in mind any previous audience, what they know about the work before and what they don't know. And she talks a lot about how for a work to be a successful adaptation, it needs to be something that functions for a knowing audience and an unknowing audience. If it's only for a specialized audience, you've definitely limited what you can do with it. And I found this a really profound idea, but it's also something that I can't shake now. So every time I come to this, the two things I'm thinking is, what was the person who created this adaptation thinking? Who were they thinking they were creating this for? What were they getting out of it? And what are they putting into it? And those are the things that I can't shake right now.
Well, and that was also, I think, one of the 18th century texts that you were looking at, I think also specifically says something like when it addresses the readers, something about, as you all know, or as readers will be all too well aware, this is taken from Chaucer.
It's borrowed from old Chaucer.
It's borrowed from old Chaucer. And I think that's such a wonderful, it does a lot of work, that little remark, because on the one hand, it sort of pulls everybody in, right? It includes you in this sort of fictional knowing audience. On the other hand, it kind of excludes other people. And not on the other hand, if there's a third hand involved, you can sort of imagine it kind of making people want to at least nod and pretend like they know who Chaucer is, in the same way that sometimes people, when I'm stopped at the border going in and out of the UK in the before times, would ask me about, medieval English literature and kind of nod and usually ask me if I was studying Shakespeare, which, well, that's a whole other episode.
Please.
I was going to say the piece Mary mentioned is actually a really interesting one because it's a ballad, and it was a ballad that was popular as a broadside, but it was also collected in anthologies. So already it's looking at two very different audiences. And you have to wonder if the audience, singing this broadside ballad in the street about the wanton wife of Bath, what they know about the Chaucer, old Chaucer's wife of Bath. Because if they know very much, they're not going to recognize the ballad. So it actually functions for both audiences in that you get kind of a giggle if you do know where it's coming from. But if you don't, it's a standalone story in its own right. And it makes it an absolutely fascinating work.
Yeah, it's sort of endless, this, isn't it? And it's not helpful that Chaucer himself is someone who is basically a story adapter and constantly name dropping his author, normally without actually giving you their name, but, constantly referring back to what his author and his authority have to say. So again, we've got this kind of real issue of stories within stories. That brings me to a technical question I had for Kristen, looking at your amazing, absolutely fantastic work. You're having to, you're adapting already incredibly complex storytelling into an entirely different art form. And I was fascinated to see how within a particular tale, so take the Nun's Priest tale, for example, as you've got the priest speaking and then starting to tell a story in which a character starts to tell a story, and then off we go into these kind of Easter eggs and kind of Russian dolls of into narrative journeys. The ways in which you yourself make sure that the viewer is able to navigate that through the use of color, etc. I wondered if you'd talk us through some of those challenges and some of those decisions.
Yes. The reason I chose to work with the Nun's Priest tale was in COVID times, I was trying to finish my master's thesis with what focus that we all had available to us. And as I was trying to narrow down this project into something that I had the materials for, that I had things on hand, that I had access to the research, I was trying to simplify things. And the simple answer to why the Nun's Priest tale is, I really like drawing birds. So I was going to go with the bird story. And going with the bird story got me digging into realizing all these different layers to it. So it starts, the chickens are the meat of it, but there's so many layers that the chickens are telling. So it's a story being told about chickens telling stories, and the people within the stories tell stories. And when I realized how nested, it's chicken's nest, how nested this was, I realized visually I was going to have to do something with that, or it wouldn't be something that a knowing or an unknown audience could follow. And so I went mostly with color. The book is done in black and white when we're seeing the pilgrims. So when the Nun's Priest is giving asides, of which there are many, or when they're reacting to each other. And when you get to the story of Chanticleer and Pertelote, it changes to blue and like a coral color, because these are the colors that are mentioned in the description of Chanticleer. So I took his coloring patterns and used that to color his story. Within his story, he's telling dreams and he's telling other stories. And for those, I bumped it down 1 degree further to be one color, either the red or the blue. I can't remember now without looking, but I think they're mostly blue where he's telling these dreams, because I wanted you, when you looked at a page, to know instantly who was talking and which of these layers of story you were dealing with. But it took a while to come up with how I was going to present that.
Yeah, and this is, I mean, can I just say too, that this is one of the reasons, many reasons why it's been wonderful to have Kristen on the project, because I think partly by discussing her creative work in connection to the project, it's a really valuable reminder of the way that adaptation is interpretation, is reader response, which is precisely what we're interested in, as, you know, at least a big chunk of the project is all about that. And when you look at 18th century responses to things like Chaucer's Obscenity, you can see in just, you know, even in nitty gritty kinds of decisions that they make about things like word choice, you can see what they're kind of interested in bringing out, suppressing, how they're trying to kind of massage this or make the most of it for their audiences. So just a few examples of this, for example, pertain to The Miller's Tale, which is a great example to use, partly because it's one that I think it's still taught quite a bit in the classroom. It's almost the one that inevitably springs to most people's minds when you talk about obscenity in the Canterbury Tales. Oh, the fart joke. And so just to kind of sum up the sort of minimal plot of The Miller's Tale, it involves a carpenter's wife named Allison and her lover, who is a clerk, a clever clerk named Nicholas, the two of whom cuckold her husband and also play a series of really nasty tricks on her other suitor, who's named Absalom, and who also happens to be a clerk, just to confuse things even further. And just to cut a long story short, Allison ends up tricking Absalom into kissing her arse. And Nicholas farts in Absalom's face before he takes his revenge with a red hot poker. And all of this is kind of, you know, the climax of the big, you know, the big joke of the tale. And one adapter, Samuel Cobb, in the 18th century, refrains completely from using the word arse in this passage, which is already pretty, you know, the sort of logistics of the situation are pretty explicit and pretty clear. But so when he is referring to Nicholas's arse, he uses words like breech and posterior. But then in the case of Allison, he doesn't use any word whatsoever. In fact, he uses a series of dashes. So it's as though, you know, even the mere idea of a lady's arse should not be kind of, you know, raised in the reader's mind, even an adulterous lady's arse. And then others go in completely other directions. So one adapter, John Smith, notes that Absalom kisses Allison twixt wind and water, which is a wonderfully poetic euphemism to use with such specificity about, you know, where Absalom's mouth is making contact. And then another 18th century adapter really builds up the joke, the fart joke at the end. He describes, you know, Nicholas as sticking his arse out the window and, quote, straining lest too soon the storm should burst. So really holding the fart in, you know, making sure none of it squeaks out before the big crucial moment. And actually just that mere phrase itself draws on Chaucer's reference to the fart as being as loud as a thunder dent, you know, as loud as a thunderclap. And so I think it's in those details, whether it's, you know, choice of color or choice of language, that we really get a glimpse into reader response to Chaucer.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And we're dealing here both with obscenity with a view from the original, if that's not a problematic term, with a view to be comic and funny and to make us laugh. But we're also dealing with sexual violence here. I mean, really quite incredible sexual violence. And the language is sort of worrying in both directions, perhaps, about how to deal with those two issues. And we've talked a bit about Chaucer as kind of literary father. And one of the weird things about English literature is that because Chaucer and Shakespeare have come to be kind of turned into those two literary dads, they're both completely obsessed with cuckoldry. And so questions about paternity, questions about the fragility of male identity are right at the heart of these two writers who are themselves sort of being christened and canonized as the great male figures of literature. So all these kind of weird contradictions around sex and identity going on. That's an incredible roadmap you've given us, Mary, of people successively trying to sort out these bottoms, sort out these arses,
Yes,
think about
yes, we
how
have to keep them in order, make it all clear, but also not too clear.
Yeah, fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And again, thinking about some of the decisions that Kristen makes in response to some of these issues, is a great moment where the priest, whilst telling the story, says that women hold in full great reverence various silly and crazy opinions, and Kristen gives us a great kind of eye roll from the women, so that we don't then silence the priest. We get to see the women responding in a kind of. So there's also kind of resistance built into some of the things that you're bringing to these stories, Kristen.
That was actually when the current project comic, you don't even know this, that's when she was born.
Oh, wow.
Was as I was drawing.
It was in the
this.
eye roll.
It was. And I got the idea. I was like, the wife of Bath has something to say about all of this. And it was a thunderclap where this whole idea came to me, that I was like, this is what I can pitch to Mary for what I can bring to the project. Mm-hmm. And it started from that panel of the eye roll, because it was clear that there were other opinions that there was space for in a visual medium, but there might not have been space for in the writing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's such a wonderful aspect, particularly given just how verbose the wife of Bath is. She's you know, irrepressible, absolutely irrepressible. And yet there are these wonderful moments where she even overtakes herself in her prologue, and she says, wait, where was I? Oh, yes, I have my tale yet. You know, and it's just that, yeah, that's such a key part of her, just that needing to be heard, needing to speak. Mm.
Yeah, that's wonderful, and so exciting to see you channeling that in the images and the illustrations you give us. The other example of that I spotted that I really enjoyed is when Chaucer or the priest tells us that the fox that seizes Chanticleer carries him off in his mouth, but also on his back. And, you know, I hadn't really noticed that before, but you quite rightly get us thinking, hang on, Geoff, how does that work? Fox anatomy of that one.
About that. Yeah. Like, you know, I can see the diagrams that you must have been drawing in stick figure. Okay, so where does that go? Where does that? Yeah.
I mean, what is going on there, both from your point of view as an artist, Kristen, and from your point of view, either of your point of view in terms of text?
I have no idea. And that did stop me, because I didn't want to change any of the text. For me, it was really important to keep the text exactly as written, other than leaving things out. And I got to that, and I was like, well, this is a key part of the story. I can't just leave it out. But how is he carrying him on his back? So I have these debates like, well, chickens are long, but they're not that long. If it was a goose, it would be different. You could have, you know, the neck in your mouth and it could be draped around the back, but the chicken is not shaped like that.
Yeah.
So I spent a lot of time sitting in the cafe like this, trying to figure out the shape of a chicken and why that decision was made. And the answer, I have no idea.
Yeah, no, but I love hearing about this, because again, this is also a process that, you know, scholars go through when they're reading these texts. I mean, when you think about the arse kissing in the Miller's Tale, I know that there's at least one article out there that has diagrams of a typical house and is trying to figure, you know, where is the window through which everybody is sticking their arses? How low is it?
I have this question.
Yeah, yes. And so these are real questions that are raised once you try to think it through.
Yeah. That's completely fascinating. I didn't expect to have the mental image in my head of trying to hold a goose in my mouth and slinging it behind me on the back, but there we go. That's where you brought me. So thank you for that. And these two examples potentially feel really different, but they're both about the physical ownership of someone else's body, right? That's what both of these moments are asking us to think about and challenging us to think about, both ethically and just at the sheer level of the pragmatics of a chicken and a fox. That's completely fascinating. I'm just looking at this other moment in the adaptation in which we hear that God woot that worldly joy is soon ago. Have I got that right? God woot that worldly joy is soon ago. This sense of, just for sheer fragility of the worlds in which these characters are in, we're constantly being asked to kind of reflect back on how sad our lives are from the point of view of characters who have been narrated by other characters, who've been narrated by the Pilgrims, being narrated by Chaucer. This is kind of constant self-reflexivity on the world around them. And in your case, Kristen, of getting us as well to think about how we feel as we navigate these texts as people who might quite easily think, am I going to get this? Am I going to be able to navigate these various questions. Your work is making us think about that long history of adaptation, but at the same time, our own experiences as we encounter fresh, new adaptations.
Well said.
Where do you see this project going next? What are the kind of next stages of the project? We've talked a bit about the 18th century. We've talked a bit about 2020 and 2021 as you've started thinking about these creative adaptations that you yourselves are producing. What's happening in between, and what's next for the project?
Well, I mean, one thing I can say is that, of the three of us, I've taken on the exciting / daunting task of essentially putting all this together with the results of my research on the medieval and early modern transmission of Chaucer's obscenity into a book that's going to cover the last 600 years of Chaucer reception. Yeah, I mean, this really is, sometimes I don't know what the Swiss were thinking when they gave me the funding for this project, because it was an absolute dream of mine. I thought, I really want to capture the bigness of that story, because it stretches across the whole period from Chaucer's death up to the present day. But I think that one of the things that has been become increasingly urgent to me in terms of things that the project addresses is related to the ethics of Chaucer's obscenity. I mean, you've already raised the subject of sexual violence, for example, which is a feature in some of the very tales that are really, very much concerned with or related to the idea of Chaucer as a body humorist. The great example of this is the Reeve's Tale, which features, non-consensual sexual assault, which is presented to us as something to laugh at. We have two students who take their revenge on a miller who's been stealing grain from them by having non-consensual sex with the miller's daughter and the miller's wife. And so this is something that I think critical attention has focused on as an example of Chaucer's naughty good humor, or his kind of, his good-humored approach to sex and sexuality. And I think that the work of scholars like Carissa Harris in particular, as well as a number of other medievalists, Nicole Nolan Sidhu is another, that work has really brought out the fact that what we have not dealt with, what we've not grappled with enough, is the fact that at the heart of these funny, quote unquote, stories is sexual violence. Rachel Moss also has an outstanding blog post on this subject called Chaucer's Funny Rape, which I think is a wonderful title because it does just put those two things together, the humor and the violence, just within 3 words. And so I think that one of the things that I am becoming increasingly concerned with as we make our way through these 3 centuries of adaptation, also of criticism, reception, is thinking about, how do we write about this responsibly? I mean, I will be very honest and say that, part of what got me into this project was just the gleeful joy of the fart jokes and the illicit sex. I mean, a great deal of it is delightful or wickedly funny. But at the same time, the deeper that I get into the topic, the more conscious I am of just how much this is a topic that cannot be separated from those issues of violence or of injustice. And so I think that that's really what I want to be highlighting more and more as we go forward in the project.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful and eye-opening. And we'll put some of the links to material that you've mentioned there, Mary, under the film, if anyone would like to follow it up. And I'm also thinking about the fact that some of the tales we've been talking about, the Miller's Tale and the Reeve's Tale, happen in a sequence, right, within the Canterbury Tales. So you get the kind of Knight's Tale, Miller's, Reeve's. I hope I'm getting that right. And scholars often talk about kind of the next the next tale satirizing the one that's gone before. But I wonder if you're also pointing to the fact that it's not really satire so much as some sort of awful ethical arms race of who can amplify and make worse the sexual politics and the forms of non-consensual assault, which are going from tale to tale, which makes those tales feel very different. Both as literary compositions and as something which people are supposed to be saying live to one another on a journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that notion of an arms race is a wonderful one because it does bring us back to the kind of verbal violence that's inherent in this quiting, as Chaucer puts it. That word quiting comes up over and over in that first cluster of tales. And yes, it can mean paying back, but also it can mean payback. And I think that that's what we see in the dynamic between those tales, comic though they may be. We see in that effort to one up the previous tale teller also, an effort to kind of stab back, punch back, hit back. And so I think that that's definitely something that we shouldn't be overlooking.
Yeah, thank you. And then the final question for you, Mary, on this subject, if that's right. And then we'll move on in terms of subject, but is there a way of tying this then to the kind of reception history that you're looking at and the adaptation history that you're looking at? We were talking earlier about kind of the fact that this is all happening, the period you're looking at is very much the formation of the British Empire and indeed of Britain. Are these arguments about obscenity also arguments about ethics? Or is it simply the wish to kind of purge Englishness of these problematic terms? Is it a purely verbal and kind of vocabulary based set of amendments, or are these also an attempts to amend, depictions of historical forms of English sexuality, gender identity? Is more at stake here, do you think? That's a big question.
No, I think there absolutely is more at stake. I mean, I think that one of the ways that obscenity itself has been defined, particularly in legal context, but also culturally, is as something that can be potentially morally corrupting. So that's thinking about obscenity very, very broadly, something that can include obscenity as understanding also a violation of religious taboos, for example. So while our project is looking at the sort of sexual and scatological side of things, that's primarily because that is what has featured in Chaucer's work and has been, has had attention called to itself both as something problematic, but also entertaining. But I think that morally corrupting element is a big part of what can lie behind changes to Chaucer's text or responses to Chaucer's text and adaptation. It's a sense that, we have seen this poet set up on a pedestal for centuries, even by 1700. And he continued, although his reputation waxed and waned, over the centuries, he's continued to at least be the name you drop when you're referring to the English poetic canon. And so then how do we deal with the fact that this father figure for English literature also included such problematic material? And I think that over the ages, that has very typically been associated with the obscenity of the tales, whether it's language or the imagery or what have you. I think currently, what we are also finally, at long last, grappling with are things like the anti-Semitic aspects of his work. So the prioress's tale being the great example, or the anti-Muslim sort of aspects of his work and how people are depicted in the Man of Law's tale, for example. And so I think that that is a good, if I cannot overuse the word example, that's a good example of how obscenity itself is bound up with these larger ethical issues, both in the present day as well as in the past.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. And then to wrap the film up, if we could move back to Kristen and some of your work, Kristen, you said earlier, and it's one of my favorite phrases in the film so far, that you like drawing birds. And drawing birds for this tale means drawing birds. I mean, we've been talking about bird on fox action. There's also a lot of bird on bird action in these stories. And Mary was talking there about the word obscene, which I guess kind of at its root means the thing which is off stage, the thing which is not in the scene, the thing which is outside the zoom camera. You can't really have those things when you're drawing your images. Everything needs to be on scene. Do you mind telling us a bit about what it means to basically chicken sex is what I'm asking you about. More about chicken sex.
Finally.
The page we're referring to falls dead center in the middle of my comic. So a short note about my process is when I'm doing these things, I'm a visual thinker, and usually one image will appear fully formed in my head. And then I get that down, and then I think in either direction. And in this case, it's from a line about Chanticleer feathering Pertolot 20 times. And my first thought was comics function typically in panels. So I was like, that's 20 squares, 20 blocks of chicken sex. And my first thought was, that is hilarious. And my next thought was, I cannot do that page. That's not, like, who expects the obscenity in the chicken story? But there it was. And drawing it is what makes it obscene in a way that reading it doesn't. It's like, oh, it's 20 times, yeah, that's ridiculous, moving right on. But to slow that line down, it's 2 lines of text, to slow it down to a full page across 20 panels really does something with that line, and I think with the story itself. So my first thought was, I cannot do this. And my next thought was, I have to do this. And I battled between these two things. So right up until it went to print, I did not know whether it was going to be the rated G, the non-chicken sex version, or the chicken sex version. And I talked to my advisor and I talked to my friends, and everyone said the chicken sex needed to be in there because it comes after a particularly heavy and long and wordy passage, and it changes the pacing of the story. And it reminds you that these are animals. Like, you have this long debate about whether dreams can be trusted and whether women can be trusted and who we listen to and why we should take a laxative. And then there's this, the chickens just go back to being chickens. So it had to do with the timing. But to sit down and draw the chickens, first of all, I had to Google chicken sex, which was awful because I was like, I don't know what that looks like. And now I know what that looks like. I didn't want to draw 20 instances for a number of reasons. And I thought 20, there's a repetitiveness to that was important. So I drew, I believe, 5, and I just flipped them and used Photoshop to repeat them. But I think that was important for me in how Pertolot is characterized, because there's something unchanging about Pertolot's reactions to this. And I think she probably has some frustration after the whole debate that she's tried to give her side and been ignored. And so I wanted to get some personality into it as well. But ultimately, it's 20 panels of chicken sex, dead center in the middle of a comic about Chaucer.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And that conversation you say happens before they have sex is so kind of oddly humanizing. So although it's sort of chickens being chickens, it also feels like chickens being humans in lots of ways. And then, of course, the next thing we get is the fox's desire for the chicken. So there's all this kind of intermingling of very different forms of bodily desire, and ones which make us think, about that link between animal and human. Just the sheer humanness of chickens having a nonchalant chat about laxatives or what have you. And then straight into that. Yes, wonderful. I don't feel we should talk about anything more. I feel we should end the film on chicken sex, but I am really excited about the fact that we have more films coming from this project in the future. And I'm really grateful to you both for telling us about Chaucer, Dryden, post-1700, the challenges and the glorious opportunities of adapting Chaucer now. We really have, I feel like we've covered lots of ground and lots of other things. And I'm really grateful to you both. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.